The year was 1505. Europe was trembling under the weight of ambition, empire, and endless bloodshed. The crowns of kings and queens were never guaranteed to last more than a heartbeat, and the fate of nations often hung on a single marriage, a single battle, or a single betrayal. In this ruthless world, a child was born, Mary of Habsburg, later known as Mary of Hungary, the woman who would one day become the Netherlands' first female regent. Mary entered the world in Brussels on the 15th of September 1505. As a daughter of one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe, the House of Habsburg. Her father was Philip the Handsome, Duke of Burgundy and King of Castile, and her mother was Joanna of Castile, better remembered by history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. Already, from the moment of her birth, Mary's fate was tangled in a web of power and madness. Mary's early years were defined not by warmth or affection, but by politics. Her grandfather was none other than Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, a man determined to expand the Habsburg Empire by any means necessary. To Maximilian, grandchildren were not children, they were pawns. Little Mary was no exception. The Habsburg dynasty had one strategy for survival: marriage as a weapon. Sons and daughters were married off across Europe like chess pieces placed on a board. For the girls, it meant leaving home at a young age, becoming wives to men they had never met, and living in foreign courts under constant suspicion. Mary and her siblings were scattered across Europe. Her older brother, Charles, would eventually become Charles V, the most powerful ruler of the 16th century, inheriting Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, and the Americas. Her sister Eleanor was married off to Portugal, then later France. Another sister, Catherine, was sent to Portugal as well. For Mary, too, destiny would not wait long. The Europe Mary was born into was a continent at war with itself. The Ottoman Turks were pressing into Hungary and the Balkans, threatening the Christian kingdoms of the West. France and the Habsburgs were locked in bitter wars for dominance in Italy. Religion itself was on the brink of revolution. Martin Luther's Reformation would erupt during Mary's lifetime, tearing Christendom apart. This was not a world that forgave weakness, especially not for women. Queens and princesses had little control over their lives. Their bodies, their marriages, their futures were traded like coins for political alliances. But in Mary's story, tragedy would not come only from the men around her. It would come from the sheer brutality of the age itself. At just 6 years old, Mary's destiny was decided for her. Her hand in marriage was promised to Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, himself only a child. The marriage was not about love. It was about strategy. The union would strengthen the fragile Christian front against the ever-growing Ottoman Empire. As she grew older, Mary was groomed for this role. She was educated not only in courtly manners and religion, but also in the arts of diplomacy. Unlike many women of her age, she was intelligent, sharp, and politically aware. Even her tutors remarked on her fiery temper and strong will, qualities that would serve her both well and terribly in the years to come. But Mary never had a choice. She was destined to leave her homeland behind and travel east, to a kingdom that stood at the very edge of Europe's survival. For the Habsburgs, family was everything and nothing. Blood bound them together, but it also trapped them in duty and sacrifice. Mary's own mother, Joanna of Castile, had been declared insane, locked away in confinement for decades, while her father, Philip, had died young, poisoned. Or so the whispers said. Mary's childhood, therefore, was not one of stability. It was one of constant reminders that dynasty came before happiness. She would learn that lesson again and again, each time more painfully than the last. Imagine Mary at 15 years old, tall, regal, with the pale complexion of the Habsburgs, and already burdened with the knowledge of her destiny. In her eyes, there might have been a glimmer of hope. Perhaps Louis, her betrothed, would be kind. Perhaps life in Hungary would bring her freedom. But deep down, she must have known the truth: her life was not her own. Her brother Charles, already rising as one of Europe's greatest monarchs, held her fate in his hands. To him, Mary was more than a sister. She was a soldier in his dynasty's war, one whose weapon was her crown. The stage was set for a story drenched in tragedy. The young girl who had once played in the halls of Brussels would soon walk the blood-soaked fields of Hungary. Her marriage would not bring stability, but grief. Her role as regent would not bring peace, but endless war. From her earliest days, Mary's life was a testament to the brutal truth of her era, that women of power were trapped in a gilded cage, forced to carry the weight of kingdoms, yet denied the freedom to choose their own destiny. She was a princess born into a world of blood and thrones, where the game of power consumed even its most innocent players. And as history would soon reveal, Mary of Hungary's life was not just one of service. It was one of suffering, sacrifice, and an end as horrifying as the age itself. The wheels of destiny turned swiftly for Mary of Habsburg. By her mid-teens, she was already prepared for the role her family had carved out for her. She was to become the queen consort of a fragile kingdom that stood on the edge of ruin. Her husband, to be Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, was only 2 years older than her. Crowned as a boy, he had inherited 2 of the most threatened thrones in Europe. The Hungarian frontier was collapsing under the constant threat of the Ottoman Empire, whose unstoppable armies were devouring Christian lands city by city, fortress by fortress. Louis was no warrior king in the mold of his ancestors. He was slight in stature, often sickly, and completely unprepared to rule a kingdom on the brink of extinction. Yet Mary was sent to him, a bride not of love but of necessity. For the Habsburgs, Hungary was a shield against the Ottomans, and Mary was the chain meant to hold that shield in place. Their marriage was celebrated in 1522, when Mary was just 17 years old. To the outside world, it was a glittering union, 2 young monarchs crowned in the bloom of youth, heirs to powerful dynasties. The people of Hungary and Bohemia cheered their new queen, hoping she would bring strength, wealth, and perhaps even peace. But behind the smiles and celebrations, shadows loomed. The Hungarian crown was drowning in debt. Its nobles were divided, more interested in protecting their own estates than defending the kingdom. The army was poorly funded, scattered, and terrified of facing the Ottomans, who had already proven themselves a terror unmatched in Europe. Mary entered this world not as a bride, but as a lifeline. Her dowry, her Habsburg name, her influence, all were weapons in a desperate struggle for survival. Life at the Hungarian court was a far cry from the polished halls of Brussels. The kingdom was poor, its politics brutal. The nobles looked at Mary with suspicion, seeing her not as their queen, but as the foreign hand of the Habsburgs. She was young, foreign, and surrounded by courtiers who whispered in languages she had yet to master. Still, Mary was not meek. She carried herself with dignity, adapting quickly to her new role. Unlike many royal brides of her age, she had a sharp political mind, and she soon began advising her husband on matters of state. Some chronicles describe her as the true strength behind the throne, but strength alone could not save Hungary. To the south, the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was preparing his armies. His empire stretched from the gates of Persia to the shores of the Mediterranean. Hungary, weak and divided, was nothing more than his next conquest. Louis II, pressured by his nobles and desperate to prove himself, decided to march to war. But the truth was plain: the Hungarian crown had neither the money nor the men to resist the might of the Ottomans. Mary must have known the truth. In her letters, she expressed both devotion to her husband and fear for their kingdom. She was young, still barely past girlhood, but she could already see the cracks that would shatter her world. The inevitable clash came in the late summer of 1526, at the small Hungarian town of Mosias. On one side, Louis II and his poorly equipped army of around 25,000 men, including peasant levies and desperate nobles. On the other, Suleiman's vast Ottoman force, nearly 60,000 strong, supported by elite janissaries and devastating artillery. Mary remained behind, praying for victory. She must have clung to the hope that her husband's courage would be enough. But when news returned from Mosias, it carried only horror. The Hungarian army was annihilated in a single afternoon. Thousands were slaughtered where they stood. Nobles and peasants alike were cut down in the mud, trampled by horses, burned by cannon fire. It was not just a battle, it was the death of a kingdom. And for Mary, the cruelest blow was yet to come. Louis II himself had fled the battlefield in chaos. Exhausted, weighed down by his armor, he tried to escape across a swollen river. There, at just 20 years old, the young king slipped from his horse and drowned in the mud. The King of Hungary and Bohemia, Mary's husband, her partner, her hope, died not with honor, but in despair, his body swallowed by the marshes. When Mary received the news, her world collapsed. She was only 21 years old, she had been queen for just 4 years, and now she was a widow in a kingdom without a king. Worse still, the Ottomans were advancing, seizing Hungarian lands with merciless speed. Mary's grief was compounded by terror. As the widow of Louis, she was vulnerable. The nobles no longer owed her loyalty. Some demanded she remarry immediately, perhaps to a powerful noble who could defend the throne. Others whispered of handing the kingdom itself to the Habsburgs or even negotiating with the Ottomans. But Mary refused to remarry. Her loyalty to Louis, however doomed, was unshaken. She chose instead to return to her Habsburg family, carrying with her the weight of Hungary's destruction. She was still young, still beautiful, but inside she was already hardened by loss. The Battle of Moha CS was more than the death of a king. It was the beginning of Mary's transformation. No longer the hopeful bride, she had become a widow forged in fire. She had witnessed firsthand the weakness of kings, the brutality of empires, and the futility of politics when faced with overwhelming force. For the rest of her life, these lessons would guide her. When she became regent of the Netherlands, she would rule with caution, suspicion, and unyielding strength, because she had already seen what happened when weakness ruled. But the scars of Mo CS never left her. They would haunt her until her death. Every decision, every policy, every act of ruthlessness she later displayed as regent could be traced back to that battlefield and to the memory of her drowned husband. Mary of Hungary had been married to a doomed king. His fate became her curse, shaping her into a woman far older than her years. She left Hungary behind, but she carried Moesius within her. The mud, the blood, the grief. This was the end of her life as a young queen, and the beginning of her true role. A regent caught in endless wars, destined to rule not with love, but with iron. The muddy waters of Moses had not only swallowed a young king, they had swallowed an entire kingdom. When Louis II drowned, Hungary collapsed into chaos. And at the heart of this collapse stood Mary, a widow at just 21 years old, her crown shattered, her future uncertain. Mary's world had changed overnight. Once a queen, she was now little more than a political widow, a prize to be claimed, a pawn in a game far larger than her grief. And for the Habsburg dynasty, pawns were meant to be played, no matter how much blood it cost. After Louis's death, Hungary became a battlefield not only between Christian and Turk, but also between rival claimants. On one side, the Hungarian nobles elected John Polya, a powerful local lord, as king. On the other, the Habsburgs insisted that the throne belonged to Louis's brother, in law, Mary's own brother, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. The choice was clear for Mary. She returned to her family, carrying with her the ruined crown of Hungary, hoping her loyalty to Charles would protect her. She abandoned the Hungarian court and fled into the arms of the dynasty that had raised her. But Charles V did not see a grieving sister. He saw a valuable piece on the chessboard. Mary, with her royal blood and her experience as queen, was no longer just family. She was a tool to tighten Habsburg control over the fractured lands of Europe. The Habsburg strategy was always the same: marriage and power. For Charles, his widowed sister could be married off again, securing another alliance. Suitors were discussed, perhaps a German prince, perhaps a French noble, even whispers of another match in Spain. But Mary resisted. Having loved and lost once, she swore she would not remarry. Her grief over Louis II had hardened into defiance. In a letter to her brother, she wrote that she wished to remain as she was. This refusal shocked the court. A young widow refusing the dynastic will of her family was nearly unthinkable. Charles was frustrated, but he recognized something in Mary, an iron will, the same ruthlessness that burned in his own veins. If she would not serve as a bride, she could serve in another way. The timing could not have been more dangerous. Across Europe, kingdoms were on the brink of collapse. The Ottomans pressed further into Hungary. France waged endless wars against the Habsburgs for control of Italy. And in the north, the fires of the Protestant Reformation were spreading rapidly, threatening to tear the Christian world apart. Charles V needed loyal governors, men and women who could hold together the far-flung territories of his empire. He ruled over Spain, Austria, Burgundy, the Netherlands, and vast colonies overseas. He could not be everywhere at once. Mary, intelligent, experienced, and bound to him by blood, became the perfect candidate. She would not be a queen, but something far more dangerous, a regent. In 1531, Charles made his decision. He appointed Mary as governor of the Netherlands. Effectively, the ruler of one of the wealthiest but most unruly regions of his empire. The Low Countries were no easy prize. Unlike Hungary, where nobles bowed to the power of kings, the Netherlands was a patchwork of fiercely independent provinces. Merchants in cities like Antwerp and Ghent wielded enormous wealth and resisted royal interference. Nobles guarded their privileges jealously, unwilling to submit fully to imperial control. And beneath it all, whispers of Protestant heresy were spreading, threatening rebellion. Charles believed that Mary, with her experience of tragedy and her loyalty to him, could succeed where others had failed. But in truth, he was sending her into a lion's den. Mary did not welcome the appointment. She had asked for peace, for retirement, perhaps even a chance to bury her grief in prayer. Instead, she was handed one of the most volatile territories in Europe. Yet she obeyed. Duty, after all, was the only language the Habsburgs knew. When Mary arrived in Brussels to assume her role, she was greeted with pomp and ceremony. But behind the pageantry, she must have seen the danger. The cities were restless, the nobles suspicious, and the merchants determined to resist any tightening of imperial authority. Her position was clear. She was not a queen in her own right. She was the instrument of her brother's will, tasked with enforcing Habsburg dominance at all costs. In Hungary, Mary had been a bride, a queen, and a widow. In the Netherlands, she became something else entirely, a political operator. Her personal grief hardened into a mask of authority. She learned to play nobles against each other, to bend merchants with promises and threats, and to enforce religious conformity with brutal efficiency. But this transformation came at a cost. The warm young woman who had once dreamed of love and family was gone. In her place stood a woman forged by tragedy, bound by duty, and watched constantly by her brother. Mary was not free. She was not sovereign. She was a regent, a caretaker of lands that would never truly belong to her, and every decision she made was judged by Charles. Mary's appointment as regent was both a triumph and a curse. It gave her power, but it also shackled her to a role that would drain her soul. Every act of governance, every tax imposed, every heretic executed, every war fought in the name of her brother, would draw her deeper into despair. She had escaped Hungary's collapse, but she had not escaped tragedy. Instead, she was walking into another battlefield, this time not with armies and swords, but with politics, religion, and betrayal. And though she could not see it yet, her years as regent of the Netherlands would be her undoing. They would crush her spirit, isolate her from her family, and leave her broken, longing for freedom that would never come. Mary of Hungary had been many things: daughter, sister, wife, widow. Now she was regent, but regent not of her own choosing. She was her brother's pawn, forced into a role she had never asked for, ruling a land that mistrusted her, in an age where failure meant not disgrace but death. Her reign in the Netherlands was about to begin, and with it, the next chapter of her horrifying fate. When Mary of Hungary took her seat as regent of the Netherlands in 1531, she entered a world even more treacherous than Hungary's battlefields. The Low Countries were no unified kingdom. They were a tangled web of 17 provinces, each with its own laws, customs, and jealous liberties. Cities like Antwerp, Ghent, and Bruges pulsed with trade and wealth, but that wealth made them independent, proud, and resistant to foreign control. The Netherlands was not a land easily ruled. It was a land that devoured rulers, turning their crowns into thorns. And Mary, still haunted by her widowhood, would soon learn that being a regent was no crown of honor. It was a crown of suffering. Mary entered Brussels not as a triumphant monarch, but as her brother's appointee. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, had ordered her into this position, trusting her with one of the richest but most restless corners of his empire. Her authority came from him alone. On the day of her installation, processions wound through the streets, guilds marched in their finery, and nobles knelt in formal submission. Yet behind the glittering display, resentment simmered. To many Dutch nobles, Mary was no liberator. She was a foreign overseer sent to tighten imperial control. She knew it. She had been queen once, worshipped in Hungary for her beauty and her name. But now she was only a regent, ruling not in her own right, but in the shadow of her brother. The pomp of the day could not hide the truth. Her crown was not gold but iron. Almost immediately, Mary was placed at the head of a new council of state, a body of advisors handpicked by Charles. These were men of influence and ambition, seasoned politicians, nobles with their own agendas, clerics determined to suppress heresy. The council was meant to guide her, but in truth, it bound her hands. Every decision she made was scrutinized, debated, and reported back to Charles. She was expected to enforce his will, not her own. For Mary, it was suffocating. She had survived Hungary by relying on her instincts, her sharp judgment. Now, she was forced to balance between her brother's demands and the fierce independence of the Dutch provinces. It was a role that offered power, but little freedom. The greatest obstacle Mary faced was not foreign invaders, but the Dutch themselves. The nobility guarded their privileges with ferocity, demanding exemptions from taxes and resisting imperial reforms. The merchants, wealthy beyond imagination, resented any interference in trade. Mary quickly discovered that the regency was a constant game of bargaining, persuasion, and threats. She cajoled nobles with titles and favors. She coaxed merchants with promises of protection. But whenever she pushed too hard, rebellion simmered beneath the surface. The city of Ghent, in particular, became a thorn in her side. Its citizens resisted imperial taxation with open defiance, forcing Mary into brutal crackdowns. Every time she raised her hand against them, she could feel the hatred burning hotter. Even worse than politics was the shadow of religion. The Protestant Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther in 1517, was spreading like wildfire. Preachers whispered against Rome, pamphlets denounced Catholic corruption, and ordinary citizens gathered in secret to read forbidden Bibles. Mary was a devout Catholic, but she was also pragmatic. She understood that harsh repression could drive the provinces into open revolt. Yet Charles demanded strict orthodoxy, and inquisitors roamed the land, hunting heretics. Burnings at the stake lit up the night sky in towns across the Netherlands. Men and women accused of heresy were strangled, drowned, or burned alive, their screams echoing through the streets. Mary authorized many of these executions reluctantly, but she authorized them nonetheless. The blood of the Reformation began to stain her regency, and with each death, the line between justice and cruelty blurred. As regent, Mary had power, but she had no peace. Her personal life was empty. She remained a widow, refusing to remarry, though proposals were occasionally put before her. She lived not as a woman free to choose her destiny, but as a servant of empire. In her private letters, Mary confessed her exhaustion. She longed for rest, for freedom from the endless demands of governance. But her brother Charles would not release her. Each year, he asked more of her, more taxes, more soldiers, more loyalty. The Netherlands was not her home. It was her prison. Over time, Mary's personality hardened. The young woman who had once dreamed of a life with Louis II was gone. In her place stood an iron lady of Brussels, sharp, suspicious, and unyielding. She learned to manipulate her council, to play nobles against each other, to silence dissent with both words and punishments. She became respected for her intelligence and her authority, but also feared for her severity. Yet inside, the cost mounted. Every compromise, every betrayal, every execution weighed on her. Her health began to suffer. Her spirit grew weary. The Netherlands was a land of wealth, but also of fire. The fires of rebellion, the fires of heresy, the fires of war. All of them simmered under Mary's regency. She managed them with skill, but she knew she was only delaying the inevitable. Her brother had given her a task no man could have succeeded in without cruelty. And as years turned into decades, Mary's reputation as a cold, ruthless ruler grew. But those who knew her best understood the truth. She was a woman trapped, sacrificing herself piece by piece for a crown of thorns that never belonged to her. Mary of Hungary was not the Netherlands' queen. She was its regent, its caretaker, its overseer. She bore the weight of 17 provinces on her shoulders, provinces that mistrusted her, hated her, and bled under her rule. It was not a crown she had chosen. It was a crown forced upon her, a crown that cut into her flesh, that drained her soul, and the worst was yet to come. For as the fires of the Reformation spread, as the wars of empire grew fiercer, Mary's regency would descend further into blood and betrayal. By the time Mary of Hungary had ruled the Netherlands for a few years, it was clear that her greatest challenge would not be rebellious nobles, greedy merchants, or even foreign wars. Her true battlefield was faith, a war not of swords but of beliefs, one that would tear apart families, cities, and kingdoms. The Protestant Reformation, born from Martin Luther's defiance in 1517, had spread like wildfire across Europe. What began as a dispute over indulgences had grown into a full-scale revolution against the Catholic Church. In the Low Countries, with their thriving cities and printing presses, Protestant ideas found fertile ground. And Mary, a Catholic regent under orders from her brother Charles V, was forced into the impossible task of stamping out a movement that could not be crushed. In towns and villages, whispers of rebellion spread in the shadows. Men and women gathered in secret to hear readings from smuggled Bibles, translated into their own language. Preachers defied the bishops, urging their followers to reject Rome's corruption and turn back to what they called the true faith. The printing presses of Antwerp and Leiden churned out pamphlets, spreading reformist ideas faster than any army could march. A single tract could cross the provinces within weeks, igniting debate, stirring anger. Mary's officials hunted these pamphlets, but for every one burned, 10 more appeared. Faith itself was slipping beyond the regent's control. Charles V was unbending. To him, Protestantism was not just heresy, it was rebellion against God and against the empire. He ordered Mary to enforce the placards, harsh decrees that made heresy punishable by death. The punishment was brutal. Suspected heretics were strangled, drowned, or burned at the stake. Their charred bodies were left as warnings in public squares. Families wept as neighbors were dragged away. Mary did not hesitate to carry out her brother's orders, but the toll was heavy. She knew that every execution deepened resentment, that every flame lit against a heretic lit another flame of rebellion. Yet she was bound. To defy Charles was unthinkable. To show mercy was dangerous. So she chose cruelty, even as it weighed on her soul. The blood spilled during Mary's regency gave the Netherlands its first martyrs. Men like Jan de Backer, a priest who preached Lutheran teachings, were executed with horrifying spectacle. Ordinary weavers, merchants, and women who dared to read the Bible in Dutch were dragged before inquisitors and condemned. The people watched in silence, but inside their anger grew. These were not foreign rebels. They were their neighbors, their kin, and with each death, the Protestant movement became stronger, not weaker. Mary may have thought she was saving the soul of her provinces. In truth, she was planting the seeds of rebellion that would one day explode into the Dutch revolt. Mary herself was not blind to the horror. In her letters, she spoke of her exhaustion, of the endless struggle against heresy. She confessed her despair to Charles, even begging him at times for leniency. But Charles was immovable. To him, religion was the very foundation of empire. A ruler who tolerated heresy invited ruin, and so Mary obeyed. She became the iron hand of the Inquisition, even when her heart ached for peace. Her reputation darkened. The merchants and nobles of the Netherlands saw her less as a governor and more as an oppressor. To them, she was the cold face of imperial cruelty, a woman who burned her own people for the sake of Rome and Madrid. But Mary's cruelty achieved the opposite of what she intended. The more she persecuted, the faster Protestantism spread. Heresy moved underground, becoming a hidden network of secret congregations, preachers, and pamphlets. Cities that once bowed quietly to Catholic ritual began to resist. Riots broke out in towns where heretics were executed. Protestant preachers stood on the outskirts of villages, shouting sermons to crowds too large for soldiers to disperse. Mary was trapped. If she showed mercy, Charles would accuse her of weakness. If she ruled with brutality, the provinces would hate her. Either way, she was drowning in a storm she could not control. Mary's personal life shrank as her political burdens grew. She had no husband, no children, no family of her own in the Netherlands. Her only constant was her duty to Charles, a duty that consumed every moment of her existence. At night, she wrote letters filled with fatigue and sorrow. She begged her brother to understand the impossible task he had given her. She longed for rest, for escape, but Charles ignored her pleas. He needed her too much. Her soul withered under the weight of fire and faith. She had once been a queen with hopes of love. Now she was a jailer, burning her own people alive to maintain a crumbling order. The Protestant storm was more than a religious struggle. It was a warning of the future, of rebellion, of bloodshed, of empire breaking apart. Mary could not have known it then, but the flames she lit would one day consume the Netherlands in full rebellion against her own dynasty. Her regency was not saving the provinces. It was hardening them. It was forging in fire a spirit of resistance that no crown, no emperor, no regent would ever break. Mary's crown of thorns pressed deeper into her flesh. She had survived the battlefield of Moses. Now she was surviving a battlefield of the soul, one where every decision damned her, no matter which path she chose. In the Netherlands, the fires of faith burned hotter each year, and Mary, trapped between loyalty to her brother and the cries of her people, could only tighten her grip. But the tighter she held, the more everything slipped away. The fires of religion were only one of Mary's burdens. The Netherlands, perched between France, Germany, and the sea, was a land that never knew peace. Under Mary's regency, war became a constant shadow, a relentless storm that drained her treasury, starved her people, and crushed her spirit. To govern the Netherlands was to govern a battlefield, and Mary, though not a soldier, found herself leading armies, raising taxes, and making decisions that cost thousands of lives. For a widow who had once prayed for peace, her regency became a reign of war without end. The greatest enemy was always France. For generations, the Habsburgs and the Valois kings of France had waged bitter wars for dominance in Europe. The Netherlands, with its wealthy cities and vital trade routes, sat directly on the fault line of this rivalry. Mary's regency coincided with some of the fiercest campaigns of the Italian wars, conflicts that dragged the Netherlands into endless skirmishes, sieges, and occupations. French armies raided Flemish towns, burning and pillaging. Mercenary bands roamed the countryside, plundering villages in the name of whichever king paid them. Mary's task was impossible: defend the provinces without draining them dry. But defense cost money, and money was always scarce. War required soldiers, fortresses, and weapons. All of these required taxes, and so Mary, under her brother's orders, squeezed the provinces for every coin she could. Merchants groaned under tariffs. Farmers cursed the levies imposed on their crops. Nobles, once proud of their privileges, now muttered darkly as their purses grew lighter. The more Mary demanded, the more resentment boiled. Cities like Ghent erupted in open defiance, refusing to pay imperial taxes. To Mary, such resistance was treason. To the people, her taxes were strangulation. Thus, war not only devastated the land, it poisoned the bond between regent and subjects, turning loyalty into hatred. Mary did not command armies herself, but she was responsible for raising them. Her generals relied on mercenaries, German, Swiss, Spanish soldiers for hire, men loyal not to crown or country but only to their pay. When the money ran out, as it often did, these mercenaries turned on the very people they were meant to protect. They looted villages, extorted cities, and terrorized peasants. Mary received the petitions, the desperate cries from her subjects begging for protection against her own soldiers. But what could she do? Without mercenaries, the French would devour the Netherlands. With them, her provinces bled from within. It was a choice between destruction and despair. As if war were not enough, nature itself turned against Mary's regency. The constant fighting disrupted harvests, ruined trade, and spread disease. In the wake of every campaign came famine and plague. Starving peasants abandoned their homes. Corpses piled in city streets. Whole villages were left deserted, swallowed by weeds and silence. Mary, already burdened with heresy and rebellion, now carried the grief of her people's suffering. She ordered grain shipments, tried to organize relief, but it was never enough. The Netherlands was wealthy, yes, but war devoured wealth faster than even its richest cities could supply. The provinces, once jewels of Europe, became scarred lands, their prosperity dimmed by endless conflict. Though she never rode at the head of an army, Mary became a commander in her own right. She negotiated alliances, raised armies, fortified cities, and corresponded constantly with her generals. Even her enemies admitted her skill. She was not a passive figurehead. She was a regent who understood the art of war. Yet this skill came at a price. Every campaign left her more weary. Every defeat scarred her pride. Every victory, fleeting as it was, demanded sacrifices she could not bear. Her brother Charles praised her, but he also demanded more. No sooner was one war ended than another began. For Mary there was no peace, only brief pauses between storms. The most dangerous challenge came not from foreign enemies, but from within. In 1539, the city of Ghent, one of the richest in the Netherlands, refused to pay Charles's taxes. The rebellion spiraled into open defiance. Mary tried negotiation, but the citizens mocked her authority. They demanded independence from imperial rule. For a regent already seen as a foreign oppressor, it was a humiliating rejection. When Charles himself marched into Ghent with an army, the rebellion was crushed with brutal force. Leaders were executed, privileges stripped away, and though Mary was spared the blame, the stain of tyranny deepened across the provinces. Ghent had shown what many others secretly believed, that under Mary's regency, the Netherlands was no longer a partner of empire, but a captive. The years of war broke Mary slowly. Each time she raised a new army, she was forced to raise new taxes. Each time she enforced taxes, her people cursed her. Each time she ordered executions, she lost another piece of herself. She had once been a queen, adored if only briefly. Now she was a regent hated by many, feared by more, loved by none. Her health suffered. She wrote to Charles of her exhaustion, of the crushing weight of responsibility. She asked to resign, to retire, to live out her days in peace. But Charles refused her every time. He needed her. And so she remained, a widow chained to war, a woman bound by duty she no longer wished to carry. War without end was not just a description of Mary's regency. It was the essence of her fate. Every campaign drained her body, every rebellion drained her soul. She was no longer Mary, the hopeful princess of Brussels. She was no longer Mary, the young queen of Hungary. She had become Mary, the tired regent of a bleeding land, locked in a cycle of wars she could not win, holding together a kingdom that despised her. And though she could not yet see it, the cracks in her regency were widening. Soon, betrayal and isolation would drive her even deeper into despair. By the late 1540s, Mary of Hungary had ruled the Netherlands for nearly 2 decades. To the outside world, she seemed every inch the Iron Regent, stern, uncompromising, a woman capable of holding together one of Europe's most volatile regions. But behind the rigid mask of authority, Mary was slowly collapsing. The years of endless war, rebellion, famine, and heresy had taken their toll. She had sacrificed her personal happiness, her health, and even her reputation in service of her brother Charles V. Yet instead of gratitude, she found herself increasingly surrounded by distrust, suspicion, and betrayal. The regent of the Netherlands was not just lonely, she was utterly isolated. Mary lived in Brussels, in the grand palace built by the Dukes of Burgundy. Its halls glittered with tapestries, courtiers, and diplomats. But for Mary, it was a prison. She had no husband, no children, no true companions. Her life was consumed entirely by governance. Letters and petitions piled on her desk daily. Decisions about taxes, executions, and military campaigns filled every hour. At night, when the palace was silent, she often wrote letters to her brother. They revealed a woman both loyal and desperate, begging Charles to release her from the burden of power. But Charles never did. His empire was too vast, his wars too many. He needed Mary, even if it meant crushing her under the weight of responsibility. Even within her own council, Mary found little comfort. The nobles and clerics who surrounded her were ambitious men, loyal first to themselves and only second to her. They flattered her in public, but whispered against her in private, seeking favor with Charles or positioning themselves for greater power. Mary was not naive. She had been betrayed before. She knew the language of deceit, the smiles that hid daggers. She learned to trust almost no one, relying instead on her own sharp instincts. But the cost was high. Suspicion consumed her court. Every decision was second-guessed. Every policy was criticized. She was trapped in a world of politics where friendship was impossible and betrayal inevitable. The greatest betrayal came not from her council, but from her own brother. For all her loyalty, Charles often treated Mary not as a sister, but as a servant. He flooded her with orders demanding obedience. He dismissed her complaints about taxes and revolts. When things went wrong, he shifted the blame onto her shoulders. When things went right, he claimed the credit. Mary longed for a word of kindness, a gesture of gratitude. But Charles was a man of iron, consumed by his empire. To him Mary was useful, nothing more. Each year that passed deepened her bitterness. She had given her youth, her strength, and her soul to her brother's cause. In return, she received only chains. Mary's isolation was worsened by tragedy. Friends and confidants she had trusted over the years either died or betrayed her. Courtiers she had once leaned on drifted away, drawn into their own intrigues. Her loneliness grew unbearable. She dined alone, walked alone, prayed alone. The regal halls of Brussels echoed with emptiness. At times, she confessed in her letters that she envied the dead, those like her husband Louis, who had died young and escaped the burdens of rule. For Mary, life had become nothing but duty and despair. Despite her inner torment, Mary never allowed the provinces to see her weakness. In public, she remained the Iron Regent, commanding, severe, and utterly unyielding. She issued decrees with authority, silenced dissent with cold efficiency, and faced ambassadors with unwavering resolve. But the mask was heavy. Each time she donned it, she felt another piece of herself slip away. She was no longer Mary the woman. She was Mary the Regent, a role she despised but could never escape. As the Protestant Reformation continued to spread, Mary's position became even more precarious. She pleaded with Charles for more flexibility, for a softer hand to calm the provinces. But Charles responded with harsher orders: more executions, more inquisitions, more taxes. Her council, eager to align with Charles, often undercut her authority, blaming her for failures while carrying out his harsher demands in his name. She became trapped between the will of her brother and the resentment of her people. Hated by both, trusted by neither, it was betrayal in its purest form. She had sacrificed everything for Charles, but he gave her only blame. She had ruled the Netherlands tirelessly, but her people saw only the flames of the stake and the claws of taxation. Years of isolation and betrayal began to warp Mary's mind. She grew suspicious of nearly everyone around her. Spies reported constantly on her nobles. Letters were opened, secrets uncovered, plots imagined. She became paranoid, convinced that her enemies lurked everywhere, in the cities, in the council, even in her own household. And perhaps she was right, for in the Netherlands, rebellion simmered constantly, waiting only for a spark. Mary's paranoia was not the fantasy of a weak mind. It was the survival instinct of a ruler who knew betrayal was her constant companion. In the quiet hours, when the palace was still, Mary confronted her deepest despair. She had given her entire life to duty, and yet she was utterly alone. She had no children to carry on her name, no husband to share her burdens, no friends she could trust. Her only legacy was her regency, a legacy written in blood, war, and fire. She had been a queen for a brief, fleeting moment, but now she was nothing more than a caretaker of empire, a pawn on her brother's board, a woman crushed by the crown of thorns she had been forced to wear. Mary's isolation was not the end of her suffering. It was only the beginning of her decline, for in the years ahead, betrayal would grow deeper, her health would falter, and even the iron will that had carried her this far would begin to break. The regent of the Netherlands had become a prisoner of her own power, and in that prison betrayal was her only companion. By the 1550s, Mary of Hungary was no longer the vibrant widow who had once stepped into Brussels with reluctant resolve. 2 decades of endless war, rebellion, famine, and betrayal had worn her down. Her face, once praised for its dignity and strength, grew lined with exhaustion. Her health faltered, her spirit weakened, and her letters to her brother Charles V revealed a woman slowly being crushed under the weight of her crown. The regency, which had begun as a duty, had become a punishment without end. And though she still ruled with outward firmness, Mary was hollow inside. She had become the living embodiment of sacrifice, and sacrifice, in her age, meant suffering. Years of stress and toil gnawed at Mary's health. She suffered from recurring fevers, migraines, and what doctors of the time called the black bile, likely depression. Her body, once strong enough to endure the hardships of widowhood, now trembled under the unrelenting pressure of governance. The burden of responsibility showed in every step she took. Her courtiers noted her fatigue, her growing frailty. She struggled to attend long sessions of council, yet forced herself to remain, knowing that even a moment of weakness could invite rebellion or mockery. But Mary's greatest illness was not of the body. It was of the soul. From dawn until late at night, Mary's life was consumed by duty. She reviewed petitions, signed decrees, corresponded with generals, negotiated with ambassadors. Every decision seemed to bring only pain: higher taxes, harsher crackdowns, more executions. In her private moments, she confessed in writing what she could not say aloud, that she felt suffocated by her role. She begged her brother again and again to release her, to allow her to retire to a convent or quiet estate. Each time, Charles denied her. For Charles, Mary was indispensable. For Mary, Charles was the jailer of her soul. What haunted Mary most was not just the endless wars or the ceaseless rebellions. It was the life she had been denied. She thought often of her husband, Louis II, dead in the mud of Mocius. Had he lived, perhaps she might have had children, a family, a softer role as queen consort. Instead, fate had given her only a brief marriage and then an eternity of loneliness. She thought of her sisters, Eleanor and Catherine, who, despite their own hardships, had children, dynasties, legacies. Mary had none. Her womb had never carried life. Her name would end with her. The crown of regency had robbed her not only of peace, but of purpose beyond duty. She was not remembered as a mother or a wife. She was remembered only as a governor, and even that legacy was bitter. Mary's court in Brussels reflected her own despair. Once filled with music and celebration, it became austere, cold, and somber. She rarely indulged in festivals or feasts. She withdrew from gaiety, surrounding herself only with business, soldiers, and clerics. Foreign ambassadors remarked on the regent's severity. She was respected, yes, but never loved. She had become the Iron Regent, a title that honored her strength while concealing the torment beneath. Behind closed doors, she was more fragile. She confided in her few loyal servants that she longed for freedom, that she prayed nightly for release from her burdens. Religion, which might have been her comfort, was instead a constant reminder of her failures. She remained a devout Catholic, kneeling in prayer daily, but her prayers brought no peace. How could they? Every day, she signed orders that condemned men and women to the flames for heresy. Every day, she enforced her brother's edicts, knowing they brought more rebellion than unity. In her heart, she must have wondered, was she truly serving God, or merely serving Charles? Was she saving souls or damning her own? Faith was her anchor, but it was also her torment. By the mid-1550s, Mary was surrounded by failure. Despite her efforts, the provinces remained restless. Despite her cruelty, Protestantism spread. Despite her taxation, the treasury bled dry from war after war. Everywhere she looked, she saw cracks. Cities plotting rebellion, nobles whispering treachery, merchants cursing her name, soldiers unpaid, mercenaries mutinous. Her brother Charles grew weaker too, his empire too vast for even him to manage. He demanded more from Mary while giving her less support. The empire that had once seemed unshakable now trembled on the edge of collapse. And Mary, its regent, felt the collapse within herself. Mary often spoke of retirement, of withdrawing from public life. But when opportunities arose, she refused to act on them. In truth, she had been a ruler too long. Power, even when it tortured her, had become her identity. She was trapped in a prison of her own making, too wary to continue ruling, yet too bound to her role to let go. The weight of the crown was unbearable, yet she could not remove it. Each day was another act of endurance. Each morning she woke to face the same endless burdens. Each night she prayed for a release that never came. By now, Mary's decline was evident to all. Her once sharp eyes dimmed with fatigue. Her body weakened. Her spirit, once iron, cracked with despair. She had become a ghost in her own palace, walking the corridors like a prisoner awaiting her sentence. The weight of the crown had crushed her, and soon it would bury her entirely. By the mid-1550s, the once mighty Charles V was crumbling. The emperor who had ruled half the known world was weary, broken by age, gout, and the impossible burdens of empire. And with his decline came Mary's long-awaited chance to lay down her own crown of thorns. For more than 2 decades, Mary of Hungary had served as regent of the Netherlands. She had begged Charles repeatedly to release her, to let her retire from the suffocating weight of governance. At last, in 1555, her wish was granted. Charles abdicated his many thrones, and with his abdication, Mary was finally free. But freedom, when it came, was not sweet. It was bitter, hollow, and drenched in sorrow. The scene was unforgettable. On October 25, 1555, in the Grand Hall of the Coudenberg Palace in Brussels, Charles V announced his abdication. Pale, sickly, leaning on the shoulder of his son Philip and the arm of his sister Mary, the emperor addressed his assembled nobles. He spoke of his exhaustion, of the burdens he could no longer bear. He wept as he handed his power to Philip II, entrusting Spain, the Netherlands, and the empire to the next generation. For Mary, standing beside her brother, it was a moment of deep conflict. She too had borne the burden of power, had carried the weight of rebellion and war. She too was exhausted. Yet while Charles stepped down to adoration and sympathy, Mary's resignation was accepted with far less warmth. Her subjects did not see her as a tired ruler deserving of gratitude. They saw her as the Iron Regent who had burned heretics, squeezed taxes, and enforced her brother's will with unyielding severity. Where Charles was remembered with reverence, Mary was remembered with bitterness. After Charles's abdication, Mary formally handed her authority to Philip II, Charles's son and heir. The transfer was cold, businesslike. Mary gave her final orders, dismissed her council, and prepared to leave Brussels for good. There were no tears, no songs of farewell. The nobles, merchants, and cities of the Netherlands were eager to see a new ruler, hoping Philip would be gentler, less severed. Mary, once feared and respected, left her post not as a beloved regent, but as a figure many were glad to see gone. It was the final cruelty of her regency. She had given her life to the Netherlands, and in return, the provinces gave her only resentment. After her resignation, Mary left Brussels and traveled south to Spain, where she hoped to find peace and retirement. She was only 50 years old, but decades of rule had aged her far beyond her years. Her journey was slow, burdened by ill health. She suffered fevers, weakness, and exhaustion, yet she clung to the hope that in Spain, near her family, she might finally find rest. But rest was elusive. Philip II, unlike his father, was cold and formal. Though he welcomed his aunt with courtesy, he had little use for her counsel or her company. For Mary, Spain became less a refuge and more a waiting room for death. In Spain, Mary's body deteriorated rapidly. Years of stress, sorrow, and unrelenting responsibility had left her broken. She developed chronic illness, her strength fading day by day. Doctors prescribed remedies of the age, bloodletting herbs, prayers. But nothing eased her suffering. She was plagued by chest pains, fatigue, and recurring infections. Some whispered she carried the hidden wounds of depression, her body reflecting the torment of her mind. By 1558, she was bedridden, unable to rise, haunted by memories of her past. In her final months, Mary often spoke of Mosses, the battlefield where her husband Louis had drowned. She never remarried, never found another love. Even in death, her heart clung to that lost king. To the moment when her life had shattered, she also thought of the Netherlands. Though she had hated her role as regent, she had poured herself into it, ruling with iron discipline. Now, as she lay dying, she must have wondered if it had all been in vain. The people she had governed despised her. The provinces she had sacrificed for were restless and rebellious. Her legacy was not gratitude, but bitterness. It was the cruelest irony. She had given everything, and yet she left nothing behind but resentment. On October 18, 1558, Mary of Hungary died in Spain at the age of 53. Her death was quiet, without the pomp of queens or the reverence of emperors. She left no children, no dynasty, no monuments. She left only the memory of a woman who had borne the unbearable, who had ruled not with joy but with iron, and who had been crushed by the very empire she served. Within weeks of her death, her brother Charles followed her into the grave. The two siblings, who had carried the Habsburg Empire on their shoulders, departed together, leaving the world to Philip II, and leaving behind a legacy of war, fire, and sorrow. Mary had spent her life as a pawn of empire, a widow turned regent, a woman forced to rule in a man's world without love, without gratitude, without peace. Her resignation had promised freedom, but it brought only illness and death. Her fate was not the triumphant retirement of a ruler who had fulfilled her duty. It was the quiet, bitter end of a woman destroyed by the very crown she wore. Mary's death closed the chapter of her life, but it did not close her story. For the Netherlands, her regency had been a rehearsal for rebellion. The seeds of discontent she had sown with executions and taxes would soon blossom into full revolt under Philip II. Her horrifying fate was not just her death, but her legacy, a woman who sacrificed everything, only to be forgotten, overshadowed, and despised. Mary of Hungary's life reads like a tragedy carved into stone, a story of duty without reward, sacrifice without peace, and power without freedom. Born into the mighty Habsburg dynasty, she was forced into a marriage that ended in tragedy, thrust into widowhood before her youth had even faded, and bound into a regency that devoured her health, happiness, and legacy. She ruled the Netherlands with iron discipline, holding together a land seething with rebellion, war, and heresy. Yet for all her sacrifices, she was remembered not as a savior, but as an oppressor. Her people cursed her taxes, despised her cruelty, and mocked her foreign rule. Her death in 1558, sick and broken in Spain, was the final irony. She had begged her brother for freedom, only to find it in the grave. History forgot her name, overshadowed by Charles V and Philip II, men whose empires she had blood to preserve. Mary's horrifying fate was not the axe, nor the fire, nor the assassin's blade. It was something darker, a life consumed by duty, ending in loneliness, bitterness, and erasure. She was the regent who saved the Netherlands from collapse, yet she was denied gratitude, peace, and remembrance. Her story is a reminder of the brutal cost of power, and of how history so often forgets the women who bore its heaviest burdens. Mary of Hungary's tale is one of tragedy, sacrifice, and betrayal, but it is also a forgotten chapter of European history that deserves to be remembered. If this story gripped you, imagine how many other lives and legacies have been buried beneath the dust of time. Don't let history's shadows fade away. Support this channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video so more people can uncover the dark, hidden past of rulers like Mary. And tell us in the comments, what do you think was the most horrifying part of her fate?